Hey folks, today's show is brought to you by Fanly, a great sports app that's free to download. Fanly is like one-stop information heaven for your favorite teams. Curates 2,000 sources like news sites, blogs, Twitter pages, game highlights, and it presents all this info in an elegant, easy-to-digest format. It's great. If you download it now, you'll be a smarter fan by tomorrow. That's Fanly, Fanly. Download it free. Now let's get to the show.
It's the Harris Football Podcast with your host, Christopher Harris.
Come on. Let's go. Hey, friends. I am Chris Harris. This is the Harris Football Podcast. September, finally here. Think you'll agree. August. Very long month. Especially when there's a podcast you have to do every weekday. But it has been so cool to see the little podcast that could grow. It still registers at the top of iTunes every single day, and that's thanks to you. I see you there, driving home from work, running at the gym, or with your earbuds in at your desk. Don't let the boss catch you. Anyway, all our NFL storylines are coming to a head. We're starting to get some interesting roster cut-downs. Tom Brady's ridiculous legal kerfuffle.
Eye roll.
Yes, it's getting some degree of resolution in the next couple days. I can't wait till there's actual tape to watch, actual games. That's when we can stop speculating. And really, that's what it is. Like, I get so many tweets at Harris Football, and we get so many emails, hey Harris at harrisfootball.com, that say who's more valuable or who will the backup be. And I'm not complaining about those tweets or emails. I get it, but you know how it goes. Last year's tape and the preseason can only tell us so much. And as smart fans, we don't listen to a word that coaches and players say. So, I'm often guessing right along with you until we actually have 2015 regular season game tape to watch. So it's cool because that's coming soon enough. And finally, I'll be able to share my film watching observations. And what's great is that now there's a daily podcast, so I don't have to rush it, and I will actually be able to tell you what I see on film on a weekly basis right here on this humble little show.
Today's kickoff.
And on today's version of this humble little show, we'll look through some cuts. The first cuts have happened in the NFL. We'll see a couple interesting names, have a couple of injury updates. Then we'll have something I hope that you'll find helpful if you're drafting over Labor Day weekend. Often we talk about boom or bust players and we say, yeah, I like drafting this guy, but make sure you team him up with someone who's nice and steady to limit your downside. Often, though, even though that's good advice, we sometimes don't actually give examples of guys who project as nice and steady. Today I'm going to give you 5 players who I think represent peak steadiness. And then after the mailbag, JJ Zachariason from NumberFire and RotoWorld will come aboard, and he'll offer up a bunch of other possible steady dudes to even out your fantasy squads. Only a few more preseason games to go before the regular season kicks off, and you could actually start the season by winning $2 million in Week 1 at DraftKings.com, America's favorite one-week fantasy football site. I've said it before, I'm a player at DraftKings. I'm on there every week, plugging away. But I want to be clear, it isn't only the super users who win in daily fantasy sports. There are thousands of winners in all kinds of contests all the time. I've said this, but my favorite kind of contest there are the 50-50s, where your goal is to finish in the top half of all entries, and if you do, you double your money. I like the 50-50s. You're not forced to try and find the totally random dude who blows up one week. You can really apply your knowledge to come up with a rock-solid team and still win. Anyway, so hurry to DraftKings.com now and use promo code Harris to get a free trial entry, and you'll discover how DFS can be the cherry on top of your, dare I say, Sunday. Enter HARRS for a free entry, for the promo code at DraftKings.com. That's DraftKings.com.
Injury news.
Well, the big one is actually an old injury with new clarification. Julius Thomas, you already knew he had broken his hand, and of course, the Jaguars, not Jaguars. The Jaguars went blah, blah, blah about how he'd be ready for week 1, and lo and behold, Thomas will not be ready for week 1, and in fact is likely to miss the first 3 or 4 games of the season after needing surgery. And remember, Julius Thomas is a guy who's had injuries linger in the past, so I am no longer considering him a top 10 option at tight end. He's now number 13 for me. Oh, and hey, there was a Joik Bell sighting out in the actual world, like the world we live in, the one that actually has like people and stuff. Bell returned to practice on Monday, albeit with limited reps, and my Twitter feed exploded. After all, I've been saying that once Bell was back, I'd consider maybe raising him back up into my top 20 running backs, since, as you know, I've maintained he's a darn good player, and I think still that he's the best value by far in that Detroit backfield. But I'm not moving him quite yet. I need to see him do more than hop around a little bit in the uniform. But it's a good first step. As I say, I'm still bullish. I've still got Bell rated as a smooth 5th or 6th round pick, which is still quite a bit higher than his average draft position. But as I said earlier, let's face it, it's really all speculation until we actually see them playing games that matter. So yeah, my speculation might be informed by having watched a lot of tape, but it was tape from last year, and thus it is still speculation. I can't wait to see them play for real. Now, off the top, you heard me mention Fanly, which is literally the only sports app I have installed on my phone. I've got it for iPhone, but it's available for Android too, and I recommend you check it out for free. The thing is, I got mighty turned off by the big media sites putting out apps that were slow to load, kind of stupid in the way they navigated, and basically made me feel like there was something wrong with my internet connection. Fanly stopped all that. It loads fast, it's totally intuitive, and it delivers a ton of stuff that's specifically about the teams I love. If you haven't downloaded it yet, do it, and if you have, tell a friend. We've all got that one friend who's just a maniac for one team. Do that friend a favor. You know he or she would totally love instant access to everything going on with his or her obsessively favorite team. So make your friend's day. They'll love you forever. That's Fanly. Get it for free. Okay, well, the cuts have begun. From a sentimental standpoint, no cut is more noteworthy than Trent Richardson not even making it through the first round with the Raiders. And I have to say, I called it back this winter when T-Rich signed and people started worrying that Latavius Murray now had legit competition. I said Richardson wouldn't make the team. But of course, that's a little late considering how I blasted the Browns a couple years ago when they initially made the trade. I think the lesson of the T-Rich balloon is that, physical ability isn't everything. Because in that rookie year of his, Richardson was in shape and he put up some very nice runs. Powerful with good feet, decent speed. But it's clear there was something the Browns could see up close that we couldn't and the Colts couldn't. And that wound up manifesting itself in Richardson being unable or unwilling to master a playbook, and in Richardson showing up out of shape. He obviously just didn't want to be great, or he didn't want to live the life he had to live in order to be great. It's a reminder to me, I'm always so quick to jump all over the media-constructed narratives that are so speculative, and probably I'm right to do so. When people in the media talk about body language, or they parse every single word out of coaches and players' mouths, it's not worth paying attention to. But just because we disbelieve the dumb media narratives doesn't mean that there aren't narratives. We just don't know what they are. And in the case of the Browns with Richardson, it's clear now that they knew him best, and they didn't believe he would do what it took to be great. It's funny, now in retrospect, I have a former colleague who has ties to the Colts locker room, and he told me Indy was worried right away. Right when T-Rich got there, they said he acted like he was already a superstar. Basically, he was a big old handful, and they were worried right away. But of course, we didn't know that, and so I popped off and very much regret it and shouldn't have done so, even though I still don't think that prior Browns administration was very good at their jobs, but that was the right thing to do. All right. I mentioned it in yesterday's show, but Fred Jackson got released in Buffalo. And that was pretty surprising, considering there was some speculation that Jackson might actually be the Week 1 starter at running back. Good to hear that LaShawn McCoy's hamstring must be feeling all right, and rookie Carlos Williams must be getting healthy too. And I do think we'll see Fred Jackson land somewhere. So if you already took him in a draft, I don't think you have to rush to drop him immediately. I think I would play it cool for a few days and see what the landing spot is, see how good it is, and then you can make your decision on Jackson. Speaking of the Bills, Tyrod Taylor is the starting quarterback. I guess I'm skeptical it'll last the entire season, but for 2 quarterback leagues and possibly for like early season DFS rosters, Taylor becomes interesting because of his running ability. You know, whether or not he'll succeed in the longer term and whether or not he can make Sammy Watkins a fantasy star will come down to his throwing accuracy. I didn't lower Watkins or anything like that. I still have hopes for him because I think he's a great prospect. But I have worries about Taylor. I admit, you know, Taylor did look good throwing the ball in the exhibition season, but things are pretty different when they start counting. And what really gives me pause is remembering Taylor at Virginia Tech, where, I mean, he was kind of a tormented soul throwing the ball. He literally never had a season in 4 years where he completed 60% of his throws. That was in college. Okay, so let's talk steadiness, or maybe we should call it safety. Basically, my goal here is looking for players that I think have relatively high floors on a weekly basis. I like to consider these players when I draft a Deshaun Jackson, a T.Y. Hilton, an Alfred Morris. What we're looking for, I think, is, you know, big workloads, relative health, and not a lot of other guys in the depth chart who are going to scare you off. So I've got 5 names for you here. I'm going to count them in reverse order, and then J.J. Zachariason will come on with several more names. Number 5 on my list. Oh, this is going to make all of you wince a little bit. Alex Smith. He's the only quarterback that we're going to talk about at all today, and I am not advocating him in a standard fantasy league, but he has a certain kind of appeal in specialty leagues, like in La Liga Lebowski, where rosters are 26 players deep, so most, if not all, starting quarterbacks are owned. I think Smith is a nice option as a backup, and I actually took him this year in La Liga. And if you're in a 2-quarterback league, again, Smith is someone to target later on because, you know, it's unbelievably frustrating to actually watch him play, his refusal to go down the field. But he's really steady. In ESPN scoring, he finished between 10 and 20 fantasy points in 11 of his 15 games last year. 3 times below, 1 time above. But by and large, he's right in that middle ground where at least he's giving you something. Part of his safety is that he's sort of a secretly good runner. Part is also that he's not turning the ball over. And yeah, I've seen the preseason, and maybe it's real. Maybe Jeremy Maclin's going to open things up. I'm skeptical. It's still Alex Smith. You know, I'm super glad that Smith isn't my favorite NFL team's quarterback, but for fantasy, a certain kind of situation, he's solid. Number 4 is Lamar Miller, the Dolphins running back. I'm not sure it's a compliment that I'm putting Miller on this list. You know, he's skills-wise should be much more boom, but for a fast guy, he rarely breaks big runs. He never had 20 carries in a game last year. So maybe I'm making some backhanded statement about his apparent lack of huge weekly upside, but I look at that Dolphins depth chart and I don't see big work for any of Miller's backups. I think Damian Williams gets some work, you know, probably annoys Miller's owners a little bit on occasion this year, but not every week, not in a huge way. If he's healthy, Miller ought to give you 250 touches from scrimmage at minimum. Solid weekly baseline between 75 and 100 scrimmage yards. I'm not sold on him as the complete package. His athletic skills don't really seem to line up with his production, in part because even after last year, I think it was more apparent 2 years ago, but even after last year, I question his ability to see creases quickly enough to take advantage of them. But if you're going on the risky side with your number one running back, I think Miller can balance that out a little bit. Number 3 in the countdown of high floor players from week to week, Alshon Jeffrey, the Bears receiver. I really just don't have a lot of concerns with him. I'm not worried about the lack of Brandon Marshall. After all, he didn't have a healthy Marshall for much of last year. I'm not worried about Jay Cutler. I don't think Cutler can play worse than he did in 2014, and Jeffrey had 1,100 yards, 10 touchdowns. Just feels like borderline double-digit targets are going to come Jeffrey's way every game if he's healthy. And he's such a monster in the red zone. He had 21 red zone targets last year, 6 touchdowns. I get that his situation probably keeps him away from the true elite number one receivers. For as much offensive attention as he'll get a lot of defensive attention too. And who knows what things wind up looking like if the Bears are really, really bad. I still feel like he gives me flexibility to take some chances with higher upside number 2 wide receivers, Brandon Cooks or Devontae Adams. All the upside in the world with those guys, but certainly scarier because they're so unproven. Number 2 on the list is LaShawn McCoy, running back for Buffalo. You're going to hear JJ talk about Shady just in a few minutes, so I'm not going to dwell too much here. As I mentioned earlier, the fact that the Bills cut Fred Jackson sure seems to speak well about McCoy's hamstring. It's hard to see the Bills not trying to make Shady the NFL's leader in rushing attempts. Tyrod Taylor, scary as the starting quarterback, I think. Rex Ryan, anyway, wants to play ground and pound. I think rumors of McCoy having a bad year last year maybe a little overstated. I felt like in the second half of the year when the Eagles' offensive line turned it around and got healthy, we were seeing the old LaShawn McCoy. It's not a great situation. It's not a great offensive line. I'm not trying to oversell you Shady, so he's not in that early first-round consideration the way he used to be with the Eagles. Slightly lower ceiling, but I do think workload gives him a high week-to-week floor. And my number 1 steady player is Randall Cobb, the Packers receiver. Jordy Nelson's out. I think Cobb might be the safest player in fantasy this year. Doesn't mean he gets you 12 touchdowns again. It's not like because Nelson is out, Cobb is suddenly the Packers' best outside threat. He's still going to run from the slot, still going to run out of the backfield. And it feels kind of fluky that he had a dozen touchdowns last year. But, he was already a 7 to 10 target receiver with Nelson healthy. That almost has to go up. And even if it doesn't, it's going to stay the same as long as he's healthy. Cobb's a great yards after catch guy. He's a big chains moving guy, really big on third down. And he's someone who's very difficult to scheme against. In the end, if you're giving help to a nickel corner, it's often with a linebacker, and linebackers just can't stay with Cobb. He's a great mismatch player. Aaron Rodgers is a pretty good mismatch quarterback. Obviously, health is a concern. I'm kind of basing this selection on the idea that Cobb's shoulder isn't hurt too badly. But, yeah, Cobb is my number 8 receiver. He's a pure second-rounder, all formats. I don't care what you play. I think Cobb's a second-rounder. And his weekly floor is high. I think if you pair him with a Deshaun Jackson, I think you'd be getting the best of both worlds.
Time for the mailbag.
Hi. This actually isn't, I haven't seen Mr. Harris, but I'm looking to get in contact with someone who has. My name's DB, and Mr. Harris has some money from me that I'd like to track down. I also would like to see if I should go QB in a 3-wide receiver league. All right, if you want to get in touch with me, that'd be great. Bye.
Man, who would have thought it? After almost 50 years of hiding so well, DB Cooper finally slips up, calling the Harris Football Podcast hotline, which you can do as well. by calling 786-529-2484, which you don't need to know number-wise because it spells out sunk by a hug. And in addition to your sightings of me, you can feel free to embody your favorite missing historical figures who are also interested in my whereabouts. And if those historical figures happen to have fantasy strategy questions, well, so much the better. Now, we start with an email from Mike Salata, who notes that the ESPN Fantasy Football Convention in Chicago that I traditionally attended happened, I guess, last weekend. And Mike emails, Chris, I saw you drunk again at the Chicago Fantasy Football Convention. I know you were drunk because you recommended I draft Forsett with my second-round pick, and you took like 3 hits off your flask in the 10 minutes I saw you. Of course, all of this stuff about citing me started with a Reddit post saying that I was hammered at last year's Chicago ESPN Fantasy Football Connection as I delivered the keynote address, which just goes to show you that maybe you shouldn't hire me to deliver your keynote address because I come across drunk even when I haven't been drinking. Ben in Missouri writes an email. I'm an RA for the University of Missouri, and I am sorry to report that we had quite the situation the other day. I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom when I heard a commotion from the lounge area. Since it was past quiet hours, I decided to investigate and found several of my residents cowering in the corner as Christopher Harris was admonishing them for thinking that Joik Bell was a bust. I approached cautiously, and when I spoke up, he whipped around, screamed, "I'll beat you all in a foot race," took off with the straight-line speed of the muscle hamster himself, and ran down the stairs. My hall coordinator would really like to bring him in for questioning, so if he is seen, please let me know as soon as possible. Thank you, Ben. And I should mention, I know this will shock the world. I myself was an RA in college. I know, you're all very surprised. I was the RA in a dorm for 2 years at Cornell University. But today, everyone takes a back seat to this
Tweet of the day.
Yes, the tweet of the day comes from Paul Huttner, who is now established as the poet laureate of the Harris Football Podcast, comes with a generous stipend. And Paul tweets in free verse, and I have to tell you where the line breaks are so you really get the true sensation here. So much depends on F. Jack's leaving and Shady's health beside the white chickens. Signed, William Carlos Williams. Ask your poetry professor.
Today's guest.
And today's guest is J.J. Zachariason. He is a honcho of sorts at NumberFire, a contributor at RotoWorld. You should be checking out his podcast that he does with Denny Carter, who, by the way, is going to be on the show tomorrow. The podcast is called Living the Stream, and I'm going to ask him about that. But first, after this incredibly long and flattering intro, JJ, I'm assuming you're blushing.
I'm definitely blushing right now.
Yeah,
you can't see it through the audio because you can't see audio, but I'm definitely blushing.
Yeah, I mean, what do they call it when you can see color, or when you can hear color? Yeah. Synesthesia.
Yes, synesthesia. Yes,
synesthesia.
Yes. I don't have that.
We are both not having synesthesia right now.
Yes.
By the way, that deserves an eye roll.
Eye roll.
Synesthesia. Coming up with that. I came up with that just.
That was good.
Out of my
that was impressive.
Rear end. Okay, so anyway, tell me about Living the Stream, because I think it's a podcast that the Harris Football Podcast listeners would really find useful.
Yeah, so, I mean, it kind of takes advantage of the supply and demand aspect of fantasy football, how you're only starting one quarterback, one tight end typically, if you're not flexing them, and one defense. And it's a way for Denny and I to kind of give recommendations each week at those 3 positions based on opposition matchups. So, last year, for instance, we went on a Fantasy Sports Network show, and we were giving quarterback recommendations each week, just one quarterback that was owned in 20% or fewer leagues. And we ended up compiling this quarterback Frankenstein that was the equivalent of a QB6. So it's one of those things where it's a strategy. Obviously I promote the late round quarterback strategy in fantasy football, but this is just taking that to the next level and realizing that there are just so many quarterbacks out there and the replaceability is so high, and you can really take advantage of that.
Yeah, I'm with you. And everybody, you can follow JJ at Late Round QB on Twitter, and that's an appropriate moniker, as he literally wrote the book
Yes.
on why taking late-round quarterbacks is good strategy. All right, so JJ, I'm having you on. We're going to talk more safety and security in the first half of the show. I listed 5 guys who I find to be, relatively safe in terms of floor from week to week, and I tasked you with the same. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to start with running backs, and I'm going to start with a player that I listed on my list. I completely agree with you that LeSean McCoy has a high floor. I talked a little bit about why, but I'd love for you to extrapolate.
Yeah, so I think that he's a popular early round bust among the industry, among experts and so on. Like I can kind of understand it. You have the injury situation going on. You have an offense that he's in that might not be the most efficient in the world. But at the same time, I think that a lot of people are looking at last year's drop off and taking it a little bit too far. I mean, everyone knocks him for that bad last season, and they're not necessarily wrong, but he still had as many top 24, so RB2 performances, or RB1, top 24 performances as Jamal Charles did. I mean, that was 9. The difference was that Jamal Charles had a higher ceiling, and every single one of Jamal Charles's top 24 performances were also top 12 performances. So that's where you get the difference in their total fantasy points. So, I think that we're going to see with McCoy a little bit of touchdown regression as well, which is a good thing, just because he's not in that Chip Kelly offense. They should be feeding him closer to the goal line, unlike what we saw in Philadelphia. And the other thing with McCoy, over the last 5 years, no running back in the entire NFL has had more top 24 performances at the running back position than LeSean McCoy. So even though, his efficiency might have dropped off last year, let's not forget how great his season was 2 seasons ago. And if he is healthy, he's a great candidate to get 300 plus touches.
That's it. I think you nailed, I said this earlier in the show, but you nailed that for me. It's all about workload. I mean, They just got rid of Fred Jackson. Carlos Williams seems like an okay prospect, big kid, but I don't think he's ready to handle anything resembling a full NFL workload. If McCoy's healthy, how is he not a candidate to lead the NFL in carries? So, neither of us is saying that he's a top 5 pick like we would have said a couple years ago, but we're saying he's the perfect guy to team with a riskier running back if you're thinking about like combos. And another safe guy in your mind, Mark Ingram. You're obviously ignoring his career before last season.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But I actually think I tend to agree with you, and the C.J. Spiller injury has something to do with it. But say more about Ingram's high floor from week to week.
Yeah, so I'm actually really into Ingram this year, probably more than what consensus is. I think that he's kind of a lock for about 220 carries in that offense if he's healthy, and he's going to get goal line work on one of the most efficient offenses in the entire NFL. So no player last year actually had more rushing attempts within the 5-yard line than Ingram, and he missed 3 games. So he actually had 3 more rushes within the 5 than DeMarco Murray did. Now you have Jimmy Graham out of the picture, who's obviously one of the best red zone threats in the entire NFL. So there's really no legitimate red zone threat for them in that offense. So I think that his touchdown ceiling is high, but at the same time, if he is, a double-digit touchdown player, that's going to raise his floor quite a bit. Obviously the fear here is that if you're in a PPR league, things are a little bit different with Ingram because they do have Spiller. Ingram's never been much of a pass catcher, although they're trying to use him a little bit more, it seems like, in the preseason and in camp. And I think that, things are certainly a little bit different this year, but here's a steady stat, if you will. Last year, only 9 running backs had more top 24 performances in PPR leagues than Ingram did, and all of them, except for Arian Foster, played in more games than Ingram did. So I know that last year was a little bit iffy just because of the injuries in that backfield to someone like Pierre Thomas and so on, but at the same time, I think that just given his volume, and I think that's going to be consistent throughout what we're talking about, just given his volume, he's going to give you a decent floor week in and week out.
So I love how we can make stats mean anything we want them to mean, because in your course of your persuasive argument, you're saying, and he missed 3 games, as though that's...
Right.
Don't you have worry that Mr. Ingram is not maybe the healthiest fellow?
Yeah. I mean, that's obviously a worry, but at the same time, it's one of those things where he plays a position that's inherently risky in terms of injury risk. So, because of that, I'm kind of more okay with jumping in and taking a chance on him. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly a concern. The other thing too with Ingram, I mean, if you're worried about an injury, I think that there's a clear handcuff in Kyrie Robinson, a clear guy that will come in and take the take the carries from him, just because I don't think, just given the way that Spiller's already hurt, given how Spiller has played in the past throughout his career, I don't think that he's going to take as many carries in that offense as some people might.
Yeah, I mean, Spiller's a nice little PPR player, but I totally agree with you that Robinson is the handcuff you want to own if you take Ingram. So where, if I might ask, where you have Ingram rated for, let's say, just standard league? Do you have him as in a 12-team league, a second-round pick, third-round pick?
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with taking him in the early third.
Okay. That's about where I have him too.
Yeah. I mean, if it's an RB heavy draft, I'm fine with going late second also.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'm a little gun shy about Ingram only because of the injuries, but I think again, you're right. Consistent workload is going to be a theme throughout this entire show. One last running back, and then we'll move on to wide receivers. It's crazy to me that this is the case, but I think I once again agree with you on workload. Mm-hmm. Chris Ivory, who, boy, workload has never been there for him in his entire career. In fact, he's always gotten hurt whenever he's gotten workload.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
but here he is. Yeah.
So I mean, the thing with Ivory, I wanted to throw someone out there that's not necessarily an early round pick, more of a mid round pick. His ADP is kind of rising a little bit, but at the same time, I think a lot of drafts you can still get him in the middle rounds. The fear with Ivory is definitely his injury history and the fact that he's now this 27-year-old running back who's supposed to break out, which is kind of frightening in a way. But I think that last season he was kind of an underrated asset in general, and not enough people are kind of talking about what he did last year, not just this year. Despite not having the backfield to himself, he still finished with 7 top 24 performances. I know I keep referencing top 24, but it's just an easy way to kind of look at a week-to-week standpoint of these players rather than looking at these cumulative numbers.
Although it's pretty touchdown specific. Like if you score a touchdown, you're going to be top 24.
Yeah, it definitely is. And a guy like Ingram, even a guy like Ivory, I mean, a lot of running backs in general that
they're pretty touchdown dependent. Yeah,
they're gonna.
I mean, the nature.
Touchdowns correlate to fantasy points more than any other statistic naturally because you score so many points. But despite not having the backfield to himself, he still finished with 7 top 24 performances, which is only one fewer than Alfred Morris and Andre Ellington in PPR leagues. So we know that he hasn't been much of a pass catcher in the past. Now they're trying to use him a little bit more in the passing game, sort of like Ingram, but even to a greater degree. The only reason Ingram has been is because CJ Spiller's been out. I think the offense should just be better and more efficient. Just given that they added Brandon Marshall, I think that you can make an argument that Ryan Fitzpatrick is better than Geno Smith. The O-line isn't necessarily awful. And I think that Ivory could finally get the carries that he's sort of deserved. He's just always had someone back there. And like you said, the risk though with Ivory is certainly the fact that he's an injury risk.
Yeah, that's what it is. I mean, I've been, like you, a big proponent of the talent. It's funny, Chris Ivory and Kyrie Robinson, really, really similar players.
Yeah, definitely.
Sort of bigger guys, but more explosive than Mark Ingram is. I mean, Ingram is a kind of a veering runner. He's one of those guys who's never really cuts, but he's powerful and he'll run over you. And if he finds some open room, he can accelerate. Ivory and Robinson both have that one cut in them that sort of shoot him off, downfield. And I mean, I'm with you on the skill. He is one of those players where it is almost like a direct proportion. And teams have always, said, okay, 200 touches is your limit because you're gonna break. But it's worth mentioning that, I mean, if you're drafting the kid in the 6th round, you're maybe not relying on him to be a pure starter every single week, and so it's worth taking on the risk. Let me ask you this about Ivory. I assume that in a point per reception ranks, you have to have him somewhat lower than you do in standard. How much?
I mean, I don't have my rankings in front of me, but I think that he would drop it. It's not a significant amount simply because once you get past that upper tier of running backs, there's so many different factors that would go into how a certain running back is going to perform in those middle rounds to begin with that, obviously he's not going to be catching as many passes, but at the same time, I think that there's still the upside with his touchdown potential. There's still the upside that, hey, maybe he'll stay healthy and maybe he'll get a lot of volume. So, he'd definitely drop in my PPR ranks, but at the same time, I don't think it's so significant that, he would drop, let's say, 2 rounds or anything like that.
I think I might have him dropping exactly 2 rounds. So JJ has just literally taken the detonator and blown up my ranks without knowing it. He just literally made me cry inside. Thanks, JJ.
It hurts. It definitely hurts his weekly floor in a PPR league. I mean, It's definitely different in standard, but it hurts his weekly floor. So even though we're talking about steady players, I think if you are in a PPR league, definitely look at Chris Ivory differently.
Yeah. That's okay. I'm not really crying in the inside. I'm awfully tough. Sad clown on the inside. So let's talk a few wide receivers who kind of fit this same description. Earlier in the podcast, I talked about Alshon Jeffrey and Randall Cobb as the safe guys that you can take very early, like second-round picks, and then afford the luxury of taking the riskier guys later. But what I like about your list is it's kind of the opposite. It's guys you're going to take maybe as your number 2 that can afford you the opportunity to take the number 1 who's the big risk, right? Who's got the crazy upside but maybe some week-to-week scary downside. Love the fact that you have Golden Tate on there, and I know there's a lot of folks who don't feel that way because they say, oh no, Calvin Johnson means Golden Tate can't be consistent, but you don't agree.
Yeah, I mean, I think that of the guys on the list, like he would be the scariest to draft, and if you're looking strictly for steadiness. But at the same time, obviously without Calvin last year, Golden Tate had 12, 13, 15, 13 targets whenever he was out, and then when Calvin Johnson was a decoy, he had 10 and 9 targets. So obviously he was a target hog without Calvin. But even if you remove the decoy games, and even if you remove the games where Calvin was out, he still had over 7 targets per game. He was still, extrapolated, would have been around the 115, 120 range in terms of volume. He's a guy that can play more of that possession role in that offense. And I think bring that all together, he has that high floor, especially in PPR leagues. Last year he finished with double-digit fantasy points in PPR leagues in all but 2 relevant fantasy weeks. So I'm excluding week 17 there. And one of those performances was over 9 points. So, I mean, obviously, Calvin being out had something to do with that. But at the same time, it's one of those situations where I think people overstate, obviously Calvin Johnson being in that lineup is not necessarily a great thing for Golden Tate, in terms of volume, which is what you need for steadiness. But don't overstate what that means at the end of the day. A huge reason that Golden Tate didn't perform in terms of fantasy points per game when Calvin Johnson came back was because of touchdowns. And that's something that hopefully he will regress to the mean quite a bit, because it got to the point where he was getting fed as much as he was. And I think he only scored like 1 touchdown with Calvin Johnson on the field with him last season. So you're hoping for a little bit of regression there. I think that he's still a fine pick. I think that you're getting, you know what you're getting whenever you're selecting Golden Tate, and that's where the steadiness kind of comes into play.
He's a number 2 fantasy wide receiver for me, too. He's my 21st. He's my 50th overall player in a standard league. He's a 5th-round pick. Rock solid. I think we're on the same page and kind of in the minority on Tate as kind of a safer guy. I mean, if I wanted to take, let's say I waited on a receiver and wound up with T.Y. Hilton and Golden Tate, as long as my running backs are really strong, or maybe I took Gronk or something,
right,
that's kind of a combo I can live with.
Yeah, totally. I'm totally fine with that.
Yeah. You put Julian Edelman on your list, and I almost think that doesn't bear a lot of discussion. He's almost the poster child.
In my notes I had Edelman is the definition of a steady floor. I mean, that is what he is. The only thing with Edelman that I would say is that the difference with him with Gronk on the field and without Gronk on the field, over the last 2 years, he's seen 11.33 targets without Gronk, and that drops to 8.71 targets per game with Gronk. So there's a little bit, but I mean, you can't just laugh off 8.71 targets
exactly.
per game.
We'll take 9 targets a game every single day.
Let alone from Tom Brady. So, I mean, to me, he's the poster child. Like
he is the poster child. I didn't even, I was, Tate and Edelman both were finalists for my list, and Edelman would have been number 1, and I was like, what am I doing? Everybody knows that one. So instead, hit me up with Allen Robinson, because I have to say, that's one that really surprises me. I get that there's going to be volume there with no Julius Thomas, for a month. I get that there's no other proven receivers. I personally don't know if I can consider any Blake Bortles target a high floor player, but convince me.
Yeah, so, I mean, last season, this is definitely a volume play. Last season, he had at least 6 targets in all games played. It's just the problem was Blake Bortles, like you said. I mean, Blake Bortles broke the NumberFire database last year with his inefficiency. He was awful. And I'll be the first one to admit that I don't love Blake Bortles as a quarterback, and I don't think that anyone should overly trust Blake Bortles as a quarterback. I think the thing with Allen Robinson that you have to kind of trust is that volume and the fact that he could easily see 140 plus targets this season. So he should, if he's healthy, be kind of top 10 range at the wide receiver position in targets. And volume kind of equates to that steadiness. Now you don't have Julius Thomas, who's supposed to be out thanks to some surgery. Marquise Lee seems to never be on the field. And at the same time, you have Allen Robinson, who, if you believe in his talent, if you think that he is, some people do think that he's a transcendent wide receiver. I mean, that he's
Dez. You heard the Dez comparisons.
That he's that good. And I'm not sure that I'm on that level, but I think that he's certainly, a strong wide receiver, a great wide receiver. And so just kind of combining that with volume, he's not going to see necessarily, crazy efficiency like we saw out of someone like Dez last year. But hopefully if he does get fed and he has that 6 target floor, you can't really say that about so many wide receivers in the NFL.
It's interesting. I mean, he is really going to be a fantastic case study, and I know I'm going to talk about him with Denny tomorrow, because tomorrow's topic is players that we're kind of overanalyzing and now have absolutely no idea what to think of.
He's the perfect example.
He really is, and that was the first name on Denny's list of guys. Like, I'm almost to the point where, he could be a top 5 receiver for how people are talking about him, or he could, be Bortles again.
The hype surrounding him is sort of reminds me. You have an offense in a pretty terrible situation for Allen Robinson. It's kind of reminding me of the way that we all hyped Josh Gordon a couple of years ago during his huge season. And I'm not saying that'd be stupid to just say that Allen Robinson is going to have a Josh Gordon-esque season, but it has that feeling to it. So that's kind of where the hype is coming from, and the way that I feel about the hype.
Right. Well, that shows that it is possible for an extraordinary athlete to excel in a really crummy offensive situation. It's not necessarily the norm, but it shows that it can happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell me this. I mean, so Robinson for me is a wide receiver 3 at best in all leagues, because I don't believe in the high floor, but I also admit that he's a hard to define player. Mm-hmm. Does he make it inside your top 24 receivers?
Yeah, I think I have him at wide receiver 25 right now.
Okay.
So I mean, he's right there. And again, to me, it's getting to that point in a draft where, hopefully, because I go running back, wide receiver heavy early, like most do.
Sure.
And so because of that, I'm not looking at, he's going to be a wide receiver 3 on my team more than likely when I'm drafting. So, I do have him around that area. But I think, you can take a chance still once you get to that 6th round, just given the assets that are there and the wide receivers that are there. I think that the upside with Allen Robinson could be pretty big.
Well, this has been useful for me anyway. I hope it's been useful for everybody else. JJ, this was great stuff. I hope now, after listening to JJ talk really smartly for 20 minutes, you guys are all going to go follow him on Twitter, at LateRoundQB, because he is a really smart dude and has great advice. And listen to the podcast, because Living the Stream really can help you if you follow what I think is the straight strategy to, kind of wait on the less scarce positions. Mm-hmm. That podcast can really help you. JJ, it was an honor to have you on, buddy, and I hope we get to do it again.
Yeah, man, I appreciate it, Chris.
And that is our show. Thank you very much for listening. Tomorrow on this very fine program, Denny Carter, who is JJ's partner on the Living the Stream podcast, will be on, and Denny and I are going to get into some players that we're just tired of thinking about. We're sort of burned out on these guys, and we've analyzed them so much that we don't know what to think about them at this point. They're hard to rank, but mostly because it's that paralysis by analysis thing. Again, thanks for listening. I hope you will consider subscribing on iTunes or whatever other podcast apps you might use. It really helps the show. You can leave reviews and nice comments, hopefully. That also helps. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will talk to you tomorrow.
The Harris Football Podcast's opening theme is Under the Gun by Apex Manor. The end theme is Tooth and Claw by OU Villain. Subscribe to the Harris Football Podcast on iTunes and never miss an episode.